What would you do if one day, without warning, a group of strangers declared that your land was no longer yours to control? That the farm your family had spent generations building was now subject to a set of rules you never agreed to? And that if you didn't obey, they would make sure you lost everything? That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Ethan Carter, and I thought I understood hardship. I grew up on this farm, watching my father, William Carter, work from sunup to sundown, fighting droughts, storms, and unpredictable markets to keep our land running. It wasn't just dirt and crops to him, it was his life's work, and he poured every ounce of his strength into making sure it survived long enough to be passed down. When he died last spring, he left me more than just land. He left me his most prized possession, his old John Deere tractor, the same one he'd used to plow these fields for decades. Before he passed, he made me promise to never let anyone take away what he built. I never thought that promise would be so hard to keep. At first, the new housing developments creeping toward our farmland didn't seem like a big deal. A few modern homes, a fresh coat of pavement on the old country road, progress, they called it. Then came the Homeowners Association. It started quietly, just a group of well-dressed suburbanites establishing community guidelines for their manicured lawns and white picket fences. They had their rules, and we had our land, at least, that's what we thought. Then, one crisp Sunday morning, I found a letter stuffed in my mailbox. So did every other farmer on our road. The paper felt too official, the wording too polished. A list of new HOA bylaws. At first glance, it looked like harmless legal jargon, until I saw the line that changed everything. All agricultural equipment must be stored out of sight or removed completely to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. I read it twice. Then a third time. It didn't make sense. Our tractors? Hidden? Removed? This wasn't about property values. This was about something bigger. I didn't know it then, but this was the first move in a game I never agreed to play, a game designed to strip me of my farm, my future, and my father's legacy. And the woman leading the charge? A power-hungry HOA president named Karen Thompson. I held the letter in my hands, my fingers tightening around the crisp paper as I read those words again. They wanted our tractors gone. Not just hidden, gone. As if they were an eyesore, as if the very machines that fed this town, this entire county, were somehow an inconvenience to the newcomers who had never worked a day in the fields. I looked up from the letter, scanning the quiet stretch of farmland around me. My father's tractor sat exactly where it had always been, gleaming under the morning sun, as much a part of this land as the soil itself. I thought of his last words to me, "Take care of her. She'll help you keep our dream alive." My blood simmered. That night, I drove into town, meeting with the other farmers at Joe Henderson's Diner, a place that had been the heart of our community long before any HOA existed. The tension was thick. Everyone had gotten the same letter. Some were nervous. Others were furious. One of the older farmers, Hank Lawson, slammed his fist on the table, his weathered face lined with anger. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl. I'll be damned if I let some HOA yuppies tell me what I can and can't do on my own land. Heads nodded around the table. But we needed a plan. We started with the diplomatic approach. We invited Karen and the HOA board to come out and see the farms, to understand why our equipment couldn't just be stored away. They refused. Karen's response was cold, dismissive. "We're not interested in farming lessons. We're interested in progress." That word again, progress. As if what we did here, the land we worked, the food we produced, was somehow holding the town back. The next morning, the real battle began. I woke up to find my irrigation system slashed, my crops covered in some kind of strange chemical. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had come onto my land in the dead of night and sabotaged my farm. Before I could even process what was happening, a county inspector pulled up in a white truck. He had a clipboard in hand and a neutral expression, but I could see it in his eyes. He was already looking for a violation. "Routine inspection," he said. "Got an anonymous tip about environmental hazards on your property." A tip. Right. My gut twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. And I had a good idea of exactly who was behind it. But it didn't stop there. Within days, the attacks escalated. The local newspaper ran a front-page article about the unsightly state of local farms, with a heavily photoshopped image of my father's tractor looking rusted and abandoned. It wasn't real, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Some of our customers at the farmers' market started pulling back, suddenly concerned about where their produce was coming from. Then came the real gut punch, an HOA letter sent out to every homeowner in the area, warning that unregulated farm equipment could pose a health risk to the community. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I got a call from my bank. My mortgage had been flagged for review. Some concerns had been raised about the long-term stability of my farm. My loan was being re-evaluated. If I didn't provide proof of financial stability within 30 days, they had the right to foreclose. I barely heard the rest of the call. I already knew what had happened. Karen had pulled strings, used her connections, twisted the system against me. And then, as if to drive the point home, she showed up on my property in person. I was fixing my fence line when I saw her striding across my yard, that smug, cream-colored suit looking hilariously out of place against the backdrop of my farm. But there was nothing funny about the self-satisfied smirk on her face or the folder clutched in her hands like a weapon. She stopped a few feet from me, tilting her head, like she was appraising an outdated piece of furniture. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, flipping open the folder. "I see you've been having some financial trouble. That's unfortunate." I didn't say anything. I just crossed my arms and stared her down. "I'm here with a solution," she continued, unfazed. "Platinum Estates is very interested in acquiring properties like yours. In fact, I have buyers lined up right now who would be willing to take this land off your hands for a generous price." There it was. The truth. This wasn't about aesthetics or community guidelines. It was about taking our land. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You think you can bully me into selling my farm?" Her smile widened. "I think you should consider your options carefully. This battle you're fighting? It's already over. You just don't know it yet." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her expensive pumps sinking into the soft earth as she made her way back to her car. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, watching her go. She thought she had won. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I barely slept that night. I kept running through the conversation with Karen, hearing her smug voice in my head, the way she'd casually dangled foreclosure over my head like a fisherman reeling in a hooked catch. She thought she had me cornered. But if there was one thing my father had taught me, it was that a man only loses when he gives up. And I wasn't giving up. The next morning, I drove into town to meet Sarah Whitman, our local council member. She had known my father and had been one of the few politicians who actually cared about preserving farmland. When I told her what was happening, she listened, her face darkening with every word. "She's trying to strong-arm you into selling," Sarah muttered, flipping through the documents I brought. "And I'd bet my last dollar she's not doing it alone." She was right. And I was about to find out just how deep the corruption ran. That afternoon, I got a call from my younger sister, Emily, who was away at college. Her voice was shaking. "Ethan, my scholarship. They're saying there's a problem with my funding. That it's under review because of a policy change in the county." A slow, cold realization crawled up my spine. This wasn't a coincidence. This was Karen. She hadn't just come for my farm, she was coming for my family. I told Emily to stay calm, that I'd figure it out, but as soon as I hung up, my hands were shaking with rage. Karen had just crossed a line. But she wasn't finished. The next night, word spread that the HOA was holding a community town hall meeting open to the public to discuss modernizing local property standards. I already knew what that meant. They were planning to turn the neighborhood against us completely, framing us as the problem that needed to be removed. So I showed up. I expected a fight, but I wasn't prepared for the full-scale ambush Karen had orchestrated. The room was packed, but not with my neighbors. Half the people there weren't even from our community. They were planted actors, hired to pose as outraged residents. One after another, these concerned citizens stood up, angrily denouncing the farms. "These old tractors are a hazard," one woman shouted. "They're ruining property values," another man chimed in. And then, the kicker, I'd never let my kids play near all that outdated, dangerous equipment. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was a staged attack. A full-blown PR stunt. And then, as Karen stood up to sympathetically acknowledge the concerns of the community, I noticed something. A man in the back, whispering to another, stuffing something into his pocket. A folded stack of cash. And in that moment, I knew. She was paying these people. I turned to Joe Henderson, who had come to support me. "Get your phone out. Record everything." Then, I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, loud enough to carry across the room. "I just have one question." The crowd quieted, eyes turning toward me. I gestured to one of the loudest, concerned citizens, in the front row. "Which street do you live on?" The man blinked. Well, What's your house number?" I pressed. He floundered. And so did the next person I asked. And the next. The tension in the room shifted. People in the back started murmuring. Karen's carefully staged performance was falling apart. That's when Joe stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I got it all on video. You paying these people?" Karen's face went pale. She stammered, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. The real community members, the ones who had been on the fence, were now watching her with suspicion. But the night wasn't over. By the time I got home, I felt a strange sense of victory. Karen had made her first big mistake. She'd gotten careless. And then I saw it. My father's tractor. The tires were slashed. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper, written in bold, jagged letters. "Accidents happen to stubborn farmers." A warning. Or maybe a promise. I clenched my fists. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I ran my fingers over the torn rubber, my chest tightening as I read the words on the note again. Accidents happen to stubborn farmers. They wanted me afraid. They wanted me to believe I was fighting a losing battle. But they had just made their biggest mistake. They had shown their hand. This wasn't about bylaws. This was a war. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I went straight to Sarah Whitman, my only real political ally, and laid everything out: the fraudulent HOA expansion, the staged town hall, the sabotage, and now, the threats. She didn't look surprised. She looked furious. "I've been hearing whispers about shady land deals, but this? This is bigger than I thought," she said, flipping through the documents I brought. "Give me a day. I need to make some calls." I didn't have to wait long. That night, Sarah called me back with something that made my heart stop. "I found something," she said, her voice sharp. "The signatures on the redistricting petition? They're fake. At least half of them belong to people who moved away years ago. Some of them are even deceased." I gripped the phone tighter. You're telling me Karen and her HOA forged legal documents? Not just Karen. There was a pause. Ethan, this goes all the way to the county commissioner. A cold wave of realization hit me. Rick Calloway. The same man who had spoken at my father's funeral, talking about the importance of preserving community heritage. He had been in on it the whole time. I sat there, staring at the wall, as the full weight of it settled in. This wasn't just a petty HOA overreach. This was an organized land grab. Karen, her husband Dan Calloway, they had been running this scam for years. Slowly expanding HOA borders, pushing out farmers, buying up the land for pennies on the dollar, then flipping it to developers for millions. And my farm was supposed to be next. I took a deep breath. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I arrived early at the big HOA meeting, a simple brown envelope tucked under my arm. The room was packed, farmers, neighbors, even reporters from the local news station. Karen stood at the podium, smiling, oblivious to the noose tightening around her neck. Before we begin voting on the emergency equipment ordinance, she started. I stepped forward. Actually, I think there's something everyone needs to see first. The room fell silent. I pulled out the first set of documents and projected them onto the meeting's display screen. Funny thing about public records, I said. They tell quite a story, if you know where to look. The first slide showed the forged signatures on the redistricting petition. The second? Financial records tracing land purchases back to Platinum Estates. The third? Emails between Calloway and Platinum Estates, discussing future luxury developments on land that was still legally owned by farmers. And then, the final nail in the coffin, a leaked audio recording. I hit play. Karen's voice filled the room, dripping with arrogance. I don't care if these dumb farmers lose their land, as long as my beach house gets built. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. People started recording. Karen's face went white. This is taken out of context, she stammered. But I wasn't done. I pulled out one last piece of evidence, a signed statement from a former HOA board member turned whistleblower. Someone who had witnessed firsthand how Karen and her husband manipulated zoning laws, staged violations, and pressured people into selling their land. The room exploded. Farmers shouted. Reporters fired off questions. Karen turned, looking for an escape. But there was none. 2 state investigators stood by the door, waiting. Her smirk was gone. She had nowhere left to run. Karen was still sputtering excuses as the investigators stepped forward. The smug confidence she had worn like armor for so long had cracked, and now, with cameras flashing and phones recording, she looked exactly like what she was, a fraud who had just lost everything. She barely had time to react before they led her away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as the crowd parted around her like a rising tide. Her husband, Dan, tried to slip out unnoticed, but he didn't make it far before he, too, was stopped. By the time the meeting ended, the entire town knew the truth. The illegal land grabs, the backdoor deals, the harassment, it had all been exposed. And just like that, the house of cards Karen had built came crashing down. Within weeks, the HOA was completely dissolved. Every single bylaw they had pushed onto us was overturned, every fraudulent zoning change was wiped from the books. The properties they had stolen from other farmers? All returned. And as for my farm? It's still here. My father's tractor, the very machine Karen had tried so hard to erase, still stands in my field, but now, it's something more than just a tool, it's a symbol. People come by to take pictures, tell stories, share in the victory we fought so hard to earn. They call it the Freedom Tractor now. Karen and her husband? They weren't just run out of town. Their arrests helped uncover similar land scams in 5 other states, leading to one of the largest HOA corruption investigations in recent history. They're both facing serious prison time. But the real victory wasn't just watching Karen's downfall, it was seeing our community come together, stronger than ever, to protect what was ours. We made sure that no one would ever try to take our land again. So now, I ask you, have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen like this? Have you ever fought back and won? Share your experiences below. I'd love to hear just how bad it got.